Hello! This is Root Locus, an analogue filter from Nekyia Circuits, who are a new manufacturer based in Greece. It's a 12 dB per octave multimode design that's based on the classic Serge VCFQ, but it adds a couple of unique twists, like the two audio inputs with a CV controllable crossfader. Connecting just one of these inputs means you effectively have a built-in VCA at the input, which opens up a world of lovely filtered AM tones. And you can crossfade between two inputs at audio rates for some more gnarly wave splicing effects. There's also a variable mode output that sweeps between low, band and high pass, and you can modulate that with CV too. And modulating the cutoff at high frequencies can open up a world of strange vocalish formant tones. Root Locus has a dedicated ping input to let you do the classic filter pings the VCFQ is famous for. And it can run at sub-audio rates, letting you slew CV signals and create complex LFOs. You can ping it in this mode too to make unique bouncy envelopes. I should also say that it sounds pretty fantastic as a traditional low-pass filter, and it does a pretty good 303 impression. Root Locus is one of 4 modules that Nekyia Circuits launched at the same time, and they've kindly sent over the full set for me to check out. The others in the range are Sasumi, which is a dual low-pass gate based on the Buchla 292 design, Opal, which is a super handy attenuverting mixer and offset generator with 3 channels that can each be routed to one of 2 buses, and the Obsidian dual complex LFO, which has some really cool analog logic functions built in. I'm planning to cover that one in more detail in a separate video in a few weeks' time. So I'll be using all 4 of the modules in this video, but I really want to focus on the weird and wonderful things you can do with the Root Locus filter. And a lot of these techniques can be applied to other filters too. You might just need 1 or 2 extra modules in some cases. So as always, you'll hopefully get some ideas you can apply to whatever filters you're using. For this demo, I've put this little box together with a few other analog modules that will complement the Nekyia quartet. I've got the New Systems Instruments tri-phase oscillator and the Expert Sleepers Lorelei as my 2 VCOs. The New Systems Inertia will be on envelope duties. I'll use the DivKid and SSF R&D Step as a random voltage generator, plus I've got a DIY dual VCA from MRG. I'll use this super basic DIY scope in the rack to visualize some of the CV signals, and my trusty old DSO-138 here to visualize the audio. Before I get into the patches themselves, I'll just give you a quick overview of Root Locus's front panel controls and do a few sweeps using the saw from the tri-phase oscillator. Okay, the front panel and controls of Root Locus are reasonably straightforward. We've got 2 inputs here on the left and right, and we've got a crossfader that mixes between them. There's also a CV input for voltage control of that crossfader, which opens up a few interesting patch ideas that I'll come on to a bit later. The mix of those 2 inputs goes through this gain control, which above 12 o'clock adds a bit of extra saturation and boost, which is really nice. And then down the bottom, we've got dedicated outputs for the low pass, band pass, notch, and high pass, plus this variable output that lets you sweep between low pass, band pass, and high pass, and there's a CV input for that too. Right in the middle there's the ping input. This lets you fire in a trigger or a gate which will excite the filter core and produce a little self-oscillating decaying tone, which is great for percussion effects. I'll come on to that in one of the later patches. There's also a sub-range switch here in the middle which lets you switch it down to sub-audio range. That means you can filter CV signals, you can ping it to produce interesting bouncing little envelopes, which I'll come on to a bit later too. We've got a dedicated frequency CV input for the filter cutoff with an attenuverter. And there's a volt per octave input for the frequency as well. We've also got a voltage control input for the Q or resonance control, main pot's up here, and then of course in the top left we've got the manual cutoff control. So let's do a few sweeps just to give you a general idea of the sound. I've got a saw wave coming in, I've got the gain at 12 o'clock, so I'm not overdriving it at all, and I'm listening to the low pass output. So with the cutoff right down, we're not hearing very much, but if I bring this up, got a nice creamy 12 dB per octave low pass. Bring up a bit of the resonance or Q. Overtones coming through. Let's go into the band pass. Do find with this filter you don't need a huge amount of resonance to make quite a drastic amount of difference to the sound. Let's try the notch, which is pretty subtle. Moving quite a narrow notch through the frequency band. It's even more subtle when the resonance goes up. This could be quite useful in feedback patching, which I'll show in a minute. And let's try the high. High pass response, and again with resonance. The variable mode output is pretty similar as you'd expect. It does add a bit more spice to the resonance and a bit of extra drive as well, so it generally sounds a little bit bigger and fatter than the dedicated outputs. Here's the low pass, and again with resonance. It's a bit more overdriven. Let's just pan through to the band pass, which is pretty quiet, and the multi-mode version, and then the high pass, which with the resonance cranked, it's quite extreme. Let's go back to the low pass, and we'll drive it a bit more here as well. So we're getting really squared off, saturated kind of sound. Now another thing that Locus is pretty good at is self-patching and feedback. Let's take the notch output and go into the frequency CV. And we can get some quite interesting wave shaping going on here, especially if I go into the high pass. Down a little bit by bringing in this notch. Get some quite extreme wave shaping. Which in combination with the resonance and the drive palette. Slow down this input. Get some interesting kind of pinging effects as well, which the resonance is. So the other thing you might be wondering is, does it self-oscillate? And the answer is yes, with a bit of self-patching again. So let's take the high-pass output into the input, and with the gain and resonance up, and I'm just going to go into the low-pass output and drive it from the high-pass from the variable. The gain here will control the amplitude. And these different outputs, when it's self-oscillating, have slightly different shapes and phases. Bandpass is a bit more square, a bit more triangular. The notch will be more square, I think. Yep. And the high will also be kind of squared off saturated sine. So you get some interesting shapes here to play with, and again you've got volt per octave control of these. And in low mode, or in sub-range mode rather, you can get these shapes as LFOs. So before I get into some of the more advanced patches, I just want to have a listen to Root Locus as a classic low-pass 303 style acid filter. I'm going to be using a really simple voice here. I've got a single saw wave from the triphase oscillator going in, got the gain set to about 2 o'clock, so it's not too overdriven yet. I've got the inertia acting as the envelope generator, just opening the VCA and also feeding into the CV input of the filter, which is not going to have any effect yet. And to sequence it, I'm using the TB3PO applet over in ornament and crime hemispheres up there. I'm using the compare applet as well to derive the accent gates as separate gates. The gate output on TB3PO is 3 volts for normal, 5 volts for accented steps. So using the comparator, you can just use those 5 volt steps and derive those gates separately. Those accent gates are going to be feeding the resonance, reducing the decay time on the envelope slightly, and increasing the level of the envelope slightly, which kind of mimics what happens in the real 303. So with the filter wide open and a little sequence set on TB3PO, got that kind of wide open saw wave. Let's just filter that right down, and let's bring in a bit of the envelope. So that envelope CV, and if I increase this attenuator, this will feed the accent gates to boost the resonance. You'll hear a couple of steps there, and I'm also going to feed the accent to shorten the decay on those steps and boost the level on those accent steps. As we increase the resonance, got a nice kind of squelchy 303 sound. Let's bring some drums in as well. Drive. Let's switch to a square wave. Move the envelope time slightly. Drive turned up, you get a slightly more aggressive tone. One of the cool things about having a voltage-controlled crossfader for the 2 inputs on Root Locus is that you can leave one input disconnected, and then that crossfader will work like a standard VCA, because you're basically fading between nothing and the other signal. So I've got a sine wave here from Expert Sleeper's Lorelei on input 1, which sounds like this. But if I pan across to input 2 again, and if I feed an envelope, which I'm going to take from inertia, triggered by this keyboard, I'm going to run that envelope voltage through the scope so you can see the shape of it, through Opal with the ×2 switch on channel 3 to bring it up from 0 to 5 to 0 to 10 volts. And then that envelope will go into the CV input of the crossfader, and effectively as that envelope rises, it'll flip the crossfader back to input 1 and allow that signal through. So it'll sound like this. Now that's all very well, and that VCA could save you an external VCA if you're just running a single sound source through Root Locus. But what I really wanted to do with this patch was use that crossfader as a VCA to apply some amplitude modulation, or AM, to that sine wave signal at audio rates. I'm going to use an audio rate square wave from the triphase oscillator here, And that AM will generate a load of harmonics, which will make that input sound, that sine wave, much, much richer, which I can then filter down using root locus. So let's have a go at that. Let's take the envelope from inertia back into the main output VCA and turn the bias down on that. And now back to how I was, but using an external VCA rather than the crossfader. Let's take the crossfader starting position to 12 o'clock, because I'm going to be using a bipolar signal from this oscillator, which will then flip from -5 to +5, which will flip that crossfader both ways. Let's run it into the third channel of Opal again. I'm going to just set it at 12 o'clock for now. And if I hold a note down now and start to bring up this attenuator, and if you see the scope, this higher frequency square wave is starting to impose itself on that sine wave, and we're getting this whole extra load of harmonics as a result of that, which makes the sound a lot richer, which I can then filter. So let's try a little sequence. And let's bring a little bit of delay on as well from Nekyia Sarajevo. And I can use a bit of that envelope on the filter as well. So that initial sine wave is now sounding really pretty. And we can sweep the frequency, or change the frequency of that AM oscillator, which changes the character quite a lot. As you get to different ratios of those frequencies, when they're sort of multiples of each other, it's much more harmonic. And the spaces in between are much more metallic. Sort of stumble across these really nice frequency ratios, which slightly squarer kind of sound there. Playing with that depth, using that attenuator, you can make it much more subtle or more extreme. I'm not even using any resonance on this patch either. There's enough harmonic extra activity added by this AM, I think. But you can bring in a bit of resonance if you like. Next, I want to look at using the voltage control crossfader again, but this time with both inputs connected. And I want to mix between a square wave from the triphase oscillator and a saw wave from Lorelei. I've got the low-pass output of the filter going into the Sasumi LPG rather than the VCA this time, and I'm going to be using a slow envelope from inertia to open and close that LPG. So there'll be kind of two levels of filtering, effectively. At the moment, the filter's wide open, and input 1 panned across to the square wave sounds like this. And if I pan over to input 2, that's the saw from Lorelei. Now, I actually want to switch these or crossfade between these at audio rate, and I want to use the square wave output from Lorelei to do the crossfading or the switching effectively, because that'll get us a nice combination of those two wave shapes. It'll kind of switch halfway through the cycle of each one, which gives us a kind of wave splicing effect, which is really good when you start detuning one of the oscillators. So let's go into, I'm going to pan the crossfader into the middle and then take the square wave output into the crossfade CV input. And now we've got a wave that's a hybrid of the square and the saw. But because they're tuned the same, they're kind of roughly cyclical, but it gets a bit more interesting when you start detuning. You get these kind of chord tones. Filter some of the edge off that a little. And let's take an LFO to that filter cutoff and just modulate that slightly. I'm self-modulating this Obsidian LFO, controlling the frequency with the frequency of the other one. I really like these kind of slightly metallic sort of sounds you can dial into. These really nice kind of chord effects. So this is a really nice kind of self-contained patch which is playing itself. I'm using a saw wave, just a straight up saw from the triphase going into the filter, and I'm using a much higher frequency sine wave from Lorelei to the FM input, which is giving us these kind of like formant vocal alien voices kind of sounds. I'm triggering the inertia envelope from the square output of the Obsidian LFO, and I'm using the second channel to modulate the first frequency, so we're getting these kind of slightly chaotic bouncing ball style rhythms being generated. Every time that LFO fires, as well as firing the envelope, it fires the first channel of the SSF and DivKid R&D step, which is generating a bunch of random voltages, which is what brings this patch to life really. I'm patching unipolar random to the attack of the envelope, so some of those notes will be a bit slower to attack, and I'm patching bipolar random to the decay time of the envelope, so some notes are longer, some notes are shorter. I'm also firing unipolar random into the resonance amount, and I'm firing bipolar random into the volt per octave FM, which is why these notes are kind of jumping around in this kind of throaty quality. I've also got a unipolar going to the shape of this sine wave, which is going from sine to saw on the modulation oscillator, just to give it a little bit more random texture. And that's pretty much all there is to it. The trick to this is really getting the modulating oscillator, which is going to the FM input here from Lorelei. That needs to be 3 octaves or so above the frequency of the triphase. And if I play with this, you can get these slightly more throaty. Love these kind of strange vocal tones you get from this. So just like the Serge VCFQ that it's based on, the Root Locus has this dedicated ping input here in the middle, which lets you feed in gates or triggers which just excite the filter core enough into self-oscillation and produce these little decaying sine wave kind of tones, which are really great for percussive sounds or melodic percussive sounds. Let's feed in a little gate pattern from the Moskwa. I've got a couple of little ratchety rhythms on there as well. I'm coming out of the low pass output at the moment. And obviously the frequency control controls the tuning, and the Q control, the resonance, controls the decay time effectively of that little tone. So with the Q maxed you get these slightly longer, and they're slightly longer at lower frequencies too. I'm just going to go through the different outputs here to compare the different tones. So this is the low pass. Band pass sounds like this. It's a bit more of a kind of transient bite there, and that's even more on the high pass. We get a slight pitch change as well, but we get this really nice kind of attacking transient. The notch doesn't really work in this mode, but the variable mode output does, and we get a slightly more driven sound here, so there's an extra kind of overtone. That's the high pass. And if I sweep down to the low pass too. So let's keep it in the high pass from the variable output, which I think is probably the richest sort of sound. And let's feed in a volt per octave sequence into the volt per octave input here. So this is just notes from the Moskwa as well. Let's tune it down a bit. Now this tone is really nice, but it also comes alive a bit more with some FM. So I've got the Expert Sleeper's Lorelei down here. Let's go into the frequency CV input and just give it a smidge. And this is just droning basically at a static frequency, which means we get quite this quite nice effect where the modulating oscillators are not changing in pitch, but the main oscillator is. And depending on what frequency you choose here, you can get some quite nice effects. But I find with FM, it's a bit more satisfying if you actually track your modulating oscillator with the same volt per octave sequence. So let's go into that stackable and mult that to there. And now, as we play with this frequency ratio, we can go into this kind of territory. Quite metallic. Kind of quite metallic percussion-y sounds, or if we go down lower, tune in these tones that are a bit more bassier. Great for these kind of electro, strange synthy percussion kind of effects. So another really cool use of the ping input is in sub-range mode. If you engage sub-range here, it will operate at sort of sub-audio frequencies. And if you ping it in that mode, then Root Locus basically generates really interesting bouncy envelope shapes. Let me show you what I mean. I've got a little sequence from step 8, which is quantized, running into the triphase oscillator with a nice rich saw combination going into the Sasumi low-pass gate. And I'm pinging Root Locus, and the output, which you can see on the scope, is this little bounce. And only the positive part of that is being picked up by the CV input on Sasumi. I'm running it through Opal here so that I can invert it if I want to, but I'm taking the high pass output at the moment. And I've got the Q right the way down, which basically gives us a single loop of the envelope, or a single cycle, before it decays away. But if I bring up the Q, we get these repetitions dying away, just like we do with the audio rate. And then if we adjust the frequency, we can play with the rhythm of those. And then Q controls the amplitude of the repeats, basically. The different outputs have a slightly different character. If I go into the low pass, and if I invert it, it's got a slightly softer attack. So you get more of a slow rise. Dialing in these frequencies and repeats, you can get these nice rhythmic triplets, quavers and semiquavers to these more extreme rhythms. Of course, these are nice to modulate as well. So while I'm still in sub-range mode, I want to look at one other thing, which is filtering CV signals to create new shapes. I've got a square wave here from Obsidian going into root locus in sub-range mode. I'm going to take the low-pass output through the scope and into inertia. I've set inertia up as a filter, so actually the inertia will be doing the filtering rather than root locus, and I've got a saw wave from triphase oscillator going through there. And yeah, at the moment with the cutoff right up and the Q right down, that's opening and closing that filter. Got a little bit of resonance on it as well. And as I start to bring down the cutoff, it'll smooth the edges off that square and get something closer to a sine as it goes right down. And if I bring up the Q, we can start to get these little wobbly. So we're changing this square wave with low frequency resonance, basically. And the speed of those little ripples is determined by the frequency control. And we can try the other outputs too. Let's go into the variable. Go into the high pass. Bring the gain up. We can get some pretty cool shapes. Okay, to finish off today, I want to look at modulating the mode CV, because you get some really interesting tones when you start modulating between low band and high pass, especially when you get up into audio rates. So I've got a square wave coming out of triphase oscillator once again into the input. I'm taking that variable mode output into the input of the Sasumi LPG, and I'm going to strike that at the ping input with a gate pattern which I'm generating in rung divisions up in the palette case. Let's just get that going. So I've just got this droning on this note. And I'm just going to bring the cutoff down to 12 o'clock. I'm in band pass at the moment. Let's bring the Q up to 12 o'clock as well. And let's give it a bit of gain. We've already got this nice rich tone with a few overtones audible. But let's take a sine wave from Lorelei at audio rate. I'm just going to go into the opal attenuator. And then let's go into the mode CV with that. As I bring this up and then adjust the tuning, as usual we can dial into a sympathetic frequency and get some really interesting I've also got coming out of rung divisions is an 8-bit CV signal, which is being advanced in that shift register. I'm going to go into the exponential FM input of this Lorelei oscillator and start modulating the pitch of this slightly, and now we get this really interesting let's put a bit of delay on this as well from Sarajevo. Depending on this cutoff, we get these we also get a bit of a change if we morph this sine wave into a saw. This extra level of brightness. That's lovely. Let's modulate that shape with a slow LFO. And bring in some other taps of that delay as well. I'm just going to leave it here, I think. Hopefully these patches are giving you a bit of an idea about what Root Locus is capable of. If you've enjoyed the video, please leave a comment and a thumbs up, share it far and wide, and of course subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.